Tipping. A seemingly basic concept that has become super controversial. From asking for up to 30% for service all the way to tip-free restaurants starting to pop up, the question is, why do we tip in the first place? What's the alternative to tipping? And how should we move forward? Let's start with the history of tipping. Although tipping wasn't always the customary 15% dollar value, in a lot of countries throughout the 1500s and 1600s, people would provide a tip to their servers in the sense of buying them a drink or sharing the amount to buy them a drink as a way of saying thank you. In other places, tips were seen as a way to bribe employees to give you especially good service or maybe even larger portions of food. So a lot of places chose not to adopt the practice because it was seen as being really unfair. The modern form of tipping was seemingly born in England, where coffee houses and other businesses began to accept tips more formally in the 1800s. In the 1850s and 1860s, Americans coming from England adopted the practice of tipping in the United States. Back then, tipping implied that you were more classy or more aristocratic than the rest of the people around you. So really, the people who started tipping in the US did it to appear better than other people. Kind of funny considering the US is built on being free and equal. And because of that fundamental belief, a lot of anti-tipping movements began to pop up in the late 1800s and early 1900s. People felt it was really unfair, and the New York Times even published several articles talking about this. One quote from an anti-tipping novel from 1916 stated, "Every tip given in the United States is a blow at our experiment in democracy." If it was so controversial back then, how did it become the standard? Unsurprisingly, it has to do with prohibition. As alcoholism rose throughout the 1800s and early 1900s, Congress started to lean towards an outright ban on alcohol. And in 1920, prohibition began, banning all recreational alcohol consumption. Previous to this, a lot of restaurants and pubs relied on the revenue from alcohol sales to pay their employees. Once they didn't have that revenue, paying their employees became a lot more difficult. One simple solution to this problem was to reduce their employees' wages and instead ask that customers tip based on the quality of service that they received. This culture spread across the United States and carried on well after Prohibition ended in 1933. Despite the fact that early adopters called the practice un-American, its spread implies that people generally agreed with the concept. Okay, so I can't be the only one that has more questions after learning about the history of tipping. When did tipping shift from being a reward to an expectation, and why does it feel like I need to tip every time I go out? There are three factors that made tipping more mainstream. The first is societal pressures. Since the early days of tipping, people felt societal pressure to tip for services. Especially if someone in the group was tipping, people felt as though it would make them look inferior if they didn't also tip. As that culture and expectations spread across the country, it became more of a standard to tip for services, changing the expectations so much that no tip actually started to mean bad service. Basically, human instincts made us adopt tipping whether we liked it or not. The next factor that made tipping more mainstream was the pandemic. Restaurants were going out of business, delivery drivers were putting themselves at risk, and we felt a pressure to reward them for that. Data has shown that throughout the pandemic, average tips increased as a way of showing gratitude for the services we were receiving. Maybe it was the risk, maybe it was just perspective, but more often than not, people were tipping higher. And that actually feeds into the third reason as well. The pandemic decreased the amount of people who were using cash to pay for things. For decades, cash has been on the decline, but nowadays there are places that don't even accept cash at all. Tipping in cash is a lot more casual than tipping with a card. Having to physically calculate and write a dollar amount or click an option on a debit machine makes you more deliberate about how much you're tipping, which again ties back into the human instincts. You can enter a lower tip into those machines, but the pressure of deliberately choosing a lower amount makes us uncomfortable, so we're more likely to choose one of the preset options. And because the pandemic brought up those average tips, those options tend to be 18, 20, and 25%. So we usually pick one of those. A few weeks ago, I was pretty disappointed with service that I got at a restaurant, and yet I still tipped 15% to the server. I was pretty confused as to what I should even do, but it felt wrong to not tip. On a trip to New York about 6 months ago, I went to a restaurant that didn't accept tips. I'd never seen that before in a restaurant, and it was kind of a cool concept. So the question I have is, could restaurants just increase the price of their food and not accept tips? Or is that a recipe for failure? Let's start with non-tipping restaurants. A lot of the time, restaurants will go one of two ways when they do this. Either they charge a service service fee at the end of the service, or they simply increase prices by 15 to 20%. Service fees can be a little bit off-putting to customers because they come at a bit of a surprise, so restaurants will often choose to just increase their prices overall. One article talks about a restaurant in Brooklyn called Fawn that opened in 2016 as a non-tipping restaurant. The owner, David Stockwell, talked about how he believed that non-tipping would be the future of restaurants, so he wanted to get ahead of the curve. Instead, what he found was that people didn't understand why the prices at his restaurant were so high. Servers found themselves having to explain why the prices were higher, and it made it a lot more confusing, ultimately leading people to spend less money. If people spend less money, it makes it harder for you to pay your employees the higher wage that you're offering. So in 2018, he decided it was better for him to leave his politics behind in his business and simply start accepting tips again. This is a surprisingly common outcome of restaurants like this. And consistent income can be great for stability, but some servers excel when it comes to tips, meaning they might not want to work in a restaurant that doesn't accept them. Ultimately, it could work, but as with anything, there's going to be sacrifices. Some restaurants, like Zazie in San Francisco, have found a lot of success in not accepting tips. They're upfront on their menu on why their prices are higher, and despite increasing their prices by 25%, they haven't received a single customer complaint. Amazon reinvented the way people shop. Netflix reinvented the way people watch TV and movies. So is one restaurant going to change the way we tip across the globe? Maybe not. But you also never know. I suppose the last consideration comes down to the people who actually get the tips. How do servers feel about this? My first question was, if restaurants stopped accepting tips, would you still want to be a server? And the response from both my friend Ava and my cousin Ashley was no. So I figured I'd ask if there's any uncomfortable situations that were created because of tips. $300 was the total. The table tipped nothing, like absolutely nothing. But because you tip out, she basically paid for them to come in. And apparently this happens a little bit more common than most people would think, and that kind of blew my mind. Tips are important. They are the basis of the wages, and if restaurants stopped accepting tips, servers might not want to work there, whether there's higher wages or not. That conversation added a lot of perspective for me. I think the whole conversation around tipping is kind of overblown. A lot of people argue that tipping can be classist and a little bit oppressive, so maybe that'll impact whether we accept tips in the future or not. As more people move towards using cards instead of cash, the trend towards higher tipping will likely continue to last from the pandemic. Currently, tipped employees in the US have an average minimum wage of $2.13, which is ridiculously low. Here in Canada, servers make tips on top of the minimum wage that everyone else gets in the country, for the most part. So that could be a bit more of a realistic way to kind of meet in the middle. I think ultimately human beings would be more likely to pay a bit more cash if it meant that their servers were getting a livable wage. So I suppose the question comes back to you. What do you think the future of tipping is? And after you're done answering that question, check out this video about the history of Los Angeles and why everyone is leaving.